Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe. IFES supports electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and we have assisted elections in European countries since the fall of the Iron Curtain. This is the 18th installment in our discussion series. So far, we've covered issues from election administration to inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of Kremlin in European politics and democracy. I am Magnus Öhman. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the IFES Regional Europe Office in the Czech Republic, and we are hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance, with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices, and is made possible through the generous support of the American people. So today, we're really discussing the status and future of democracy in Europe. But we won't do that at an abstract level. Rather, we'll look at two crucial elections that happened earlier this month in Hungary and in Serbia. So in Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who has been called authoritarian and a key Putin ally, remains Prime Minister. And in line with expectations, the incumbent President Alexander Vučić, who has been described as pro-Kremlin and a populist, won the elections in Serbia with a significant margin. What do these elections and their outcomes mean for these countries and for Europe as a whole? What is the future of democratic values and the rule of law in Europe? To discuss these issues, we have with us prominent experts on politics and elections in Hungary, in Serbia, and beyond. But we'll start by looking at Hungary, and I'll first turn to Marta Pardavi, who is co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. And we'll look at these elections also from a regional perspective, together with Peter Novotny, who is Program Director at Civil Lives, based in Slovakia. Then let's turn to the Serbian elections and first talk to Bojan Klacar, who's Executive Director at the Center for Free Elections and Democracy Serbia. And we'll talk about these elections and the regional context together with Nermin Nisic, IFES Country Director in Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Serbia. We'll then open for questions and for comments. If you have any questions to our panelists, you can already now type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let's start by talking about Hungary. And let me turn to Marta Pardavi, co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Marta, I understand that the Hungarian civil society was very mobilized ahead of this general election, also compared to previous Hungarian elections. Could you give us some examples of that and give us your thoughts about what that means for the outcome of the elections and for Hungarian democracy?
Thank you very much, Magnus, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be along such a great panel. And also to talk about Hungary and Serbia, and there's quite a lot of commonalities. Indeed, in the last parliamentary elections, 2018, there was a lot of lessons learned in Hungary, and one of them, I think, was for civil society. And this time around, there was far more mobilization and activity by independent civil society organizations and movements and informal groups than previously. I think this comes out from the realization that democracy is really not only backtracking and backsliding, but is at fundamental risk. And we can no longer assume that elections will be fair and free everywhere in the EU. Hungary is an important concern and example for this. And so civil society basically mobilized itself to tackle every single one of the issues and the segments of an electoral campaign process. There were organizations who were informing voters, really promoting the idea of participation in the elections, particularly targeting young people, or certain segments of Hungary's population living in more impoverished regions, bringing the idea of participation to them. This was, for example, something that the Clean Voting Coalition did. They did hands-on training and also did monitoring of what happens around polling stations. The Hungarian election system doesn't allow for domestic independent observers, so civil society is facing serious restrictions on observing elections, but within this framework, people were really out there around polling stations in crucial areas, making sure that they would monitor any irregularities. There were hotlines, legal aid helplines set up. There was very much campaigning and focus on making sure that those who are in the polling station themselves, the members of the local election commissions, would be much better prepared than in 2018. And so, for example, an organization that is called Unhacked Democracy developed an e-learning program. They ran campaigns, very good videos, clips made with actors to encourage people to participate and to ensure that their vote would be clean and fairly treated. There was also, I wouldn't really call it a civil society initiative, but an important initiative to ensure that the independent persons mandated to uphold election standards in the local election commissions would actually be fully staffed. And so this 20K movement that was affiliated with the opposition coalition ensured that there would be sufficient number of election officials, local election officials in place to ensure that voting goes well. And I think altogether, there was also an important focus on ensuring election standards and monitoring this by independent international observers. And so many civil society organizations, including the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, called for a fully fledged election observation mission from ODIHR. And we wanted to ensure that the idea that EU member states themselves are seeing concerns and must take action to address these is coming out through the Hungarian elections.
Thank you very much, Marta. Unfortunately, in the last few months, we have often returned to the issue of the Ukrainian war, the invasion by the Russian Federation. I mean, unfortunately, because the war is taking place. Obviously, that has major impact also outside of Ukraine, outside of Russia, including on the Hungarian election. What would, in your mind, was the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for the election campaign and indeed for the outcome of the elections?
Certainly, given that the elections were held on April 3rd, the Russian invasion, aggression started on February 24th, just 6 weeks ahead of the election day. And so this gave the whole election campaign a completely unexpected turn. It took a few days, I think, for all actors, the political parties, to find a new path, a new narrative. And certainly the Fidesz and the Hungarian government, headed by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, focused on basically conjuring up the threat of war spilling over to Hungary, the physical threat of armed conflict approaching Hungarian citizens in the closest manner possible, and also the threat of financial impact, the rising costs of utility prices, which has been a very important campaign topic and something that many voters favored Fidesz for. And so using this, the war, as a threat and as basically portraying himself and his government as the sole protector, the sole defender against this threat, Orbán really boosted fears and also at the same time offered an opportunity for people to feel secure. Now, this of course doesn't work for everybody, but it did resonate with a large part of his own voter base and maybe even beyond. And this, the reason why it resonated so well is, of course, not, it's very closely linked to the fact that there's such a big media dominance of Fidesz, both through the public media, both through private media conglomerates. And so it is almost unavoidable for voters during the campaign to not hear and come across the visual images or the audio images of the war and the great protector of the nation, if I can say this. And I think this really tilted an already very tilted playing field in his favor. Of course, this is not to say that this was the only reason, but I think it was very, very unfortunately for I think Hungary's relations going, beyond and forward. This really mattered for the Hungarian election outcome.
Thank you, Marta. I want to now move to the fact that on the same day, or together with the elections, there was also a referendum held. And I think that also talks and says quite a lot about democracy in Hungary and in Europe as a whole. So the referendum, the questions were provided by the government, and they presented these as being for the protection of children, while critics argued that the referendum was meant to stir up hatred against LGBTQI persons. How would, in your mind, did this impact the election campaign?
This is, conjuring up an enemy, a threat, and then using that as something that the Hungarians have to be shielded against or from it, is of course a classic campaign tool. And even between election campaigns, this has been characteristic of Hungary's politics for a very long time. Now, after many iterations, it was seen, I think, that the LGBT community would be the next target in this government fueled, taxpayer-funded, often hate campaign. And the 2021 anti-LGBT law that basically limits and restricts the portrayal, the public portrayal of LGBT rights, of people, of ideas. This was a tool to in this toolbox to conjure up an enemy and to then portray the government as the only possible actor to defend against this enemy. Now, this law was passed, as you said. There was not only enormous outcry, but actually legal action was taken against it by the European Commission. Many people remember that this was a very heated debate for 2 hours in a European Council meeting where Mr. Öhman was really, confronted with the critical remarks of his own peers. And the government then initiated a referendum. Now, this means that the government can campaign as much as it wants on the referendum theme with no limitations on funding, for example. And given that the referendum was happening on the same day as the elections, this, of course, cannot be taken separately from the elections. So there was an abundance of resources and channels to convey messages to the public used by the government. The opposition politicians, the political parties decided not to really address this head on. For a variety of reasons, they felt that this would basically use the same framing that the Hungarian government was using, and they wouldn't be able to come out of this in a positive way. Basically, it meant that civil society organizations had to campaign. And so a coalition of 16 organizations was set up. And it was a really very, very beautiful campaign in I think, conveying messages of positive values, but also persuaded the voters. And the referendum itself failed, and it failed big. Because every fifth person who participated, over almost 21% of the voters, cast an invalid vote. We said that such a nonsensical and hate-fueling set of questions can only be answered with an invalid vote. People should show that they want to participate, but they should also convey the message that this is not a valid question. And so the vote, the referendum failed. this, of course, and I think we can talk about this, but this also meant backlash on civil society, as usual almost in Hungary.
Right, so as you mentioned, the referendum did not produce a valid result, as it did not less than half of registered voters cast a valid vote. And as you mentioned, many cast invalid votes, of course, as it's an active protest. So I understand that after the elections, following this, 16 civil society groups that campaigned against the referendum, not in one of the side of the referendums, have been fined by the election commission in Hungary for encouraging people to cast invalid votes. Well, what's your take on that issue, and what do you think the strategy of these civil society groups will be?
So the Hungarian Helsinki Committee is one of these affected organizations. We are part of this 16-member coalition that is headed by Amnesty International Hungary and a very excellent LGBT rights organization called Háttér. Those two were fined 8,000 euros each, and the rest, the 14, received fines of a few hundred euros, about 450 euros. Now, the reason the Election Commission decided to fine these organizations was because they received a complaint from individuals who are not disclosed, but they're likely to be affiliated with far-right extremist organizations. So there was a sort of a citizen action, and then the Election Commission's response. The Election Commission said that this campaign to calling on voters to cast invalid votes was basically an abuse of the right. And well, this is of course met with quite a lot of outrage and also surprise. This is a new thing, I think, in Hungary. The tool of creating a chilling effect, having, intimidating messaging, even legal measures, is something that we've been living with for a number of years, but to actually fine organizations for calling on citizens to exercise their right to freedom of expression was new. And of course, we all contested this decision, the 16 decisions in court, and there was at the Supreme Court of Hungary, the Curia, and 5 decisions were rendered by the court, and 3 actually went one way, and then there were two additional ones. So different chambers of the court, different panels of judges took decisions. 3 basically very clearly said that the organizations were within their right to freedom of expression. This was a legitimate, lawful manner. And so our fines were quashed, but not in the case of Háttér, which is still has to pay this 8,000 euro fine. They turned, Amnesty and Háttér, the 2 organizations where the Election Commission's decisions were upheld, they turned to the Constitutional Court. This is a remedy that must be exhausted, but my personal guess is that it will not really be an effective remedy. And then it's very likely this will end up, of course, in the European Court of Human Rights. I think it's very important for us civil society organizations that we were acting in coalition, that we were very good in the campaign. The campaign messaging was, I think, something that many organizations or movements around Europe confronted with this kind of anti-LGBT campaigns can use. And also the fact that so many voters responded to our call also shows that it was a well-conducted and appropriate campaign. The intimidating message and the decision was, of course, something that gives us a signal of the way Hungary is, but it will not deter these organizations from carrying out similar actions in the future if there's a need.
Thank you very much, Marta Pardavi from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. And let's now turn to Peter Novotny, Program Director of Civil Eye in Slovakia. So Peter, the recent parliamentary elections that we've just been talking to Marta about were closely watched by international observers. What's your assessment of the electoral process, including the campaign and of course, the outcome?
Thank you for inviting me. Basically, I was one of the observers which were monitoring Hungarian elections, parliamentary elections. There were more than 900 observers, and we were part of full-fledged mission of the NMO. There was also OEC ODIHR observation mission. And our findings, we can divide in two categories. One was election day. It was very well managed. It was efficiently conducted, and we haven't seen any major shortcomings except for some irregularities regarding the secrecy of the vote. However, the election process is not just the election day, and this is a problem with the election campaign, and it was very negative on both sides. But of course, the government controlled state machinery of state media and public media and private media, which favors Fidesz ruling party, where running campaigns which even overlap the campaign between the ruling coalition and the government. There was also a campaign about the referendum, so this was all mixed together with another issue that the campaign finance regulations are very weak, and there was possibility to finance also these campaigns without enough transparency, also through third party. So there were no public debates among the candidates. As I said, the campaign was very negative, and it was actually, it shifted from the initial campaign with the Russian or Kremlin invasion of Ukraine, and then the both sides, united opposition and the ruling party, had to change their campaign rhetorics and narratives, and Fidesz built already a huge machinery of I said, state-controlled and private actors, which pushed their message, and it was stronger. That Viktor Orbán seems to be a peacemaker, and the opposition would pose a threat for Hungarian voters. So this was kind of helping Fidesz and their actors to push their narrative. And of course, in the case of crisis, like we saw in COVID cases or war near your borders, the voters probably just voted for Fidesz. And we must see also the electoral system, mixed system in Hungary, cements the rule of Fidesz for already fourth time. They won. Usually they win between 44 to 52%, which was now the case, but they reach two-third majority, constitutional majority, which is 68, 69% of the seats. So clearly this system is favoring Fidesz, and it was introduced by this ruling party before 2014. They changed this electoral system. So we can see that there is a problem, and of course the election observation missions will present their final reports with recommendations how to improve the process in Hungary.
So if we broaden the issue a bit, Peter, how do you assess the quality of the electoral process and the state of democracy in Hungary today?
So it is quite difficult because the election procedures are quite well developed. Of course, there is always space for improvement regarding the secrecy of vote, because the Hungarian voters don't need to go to the booth to mark their ballots. And so there are some procedural improvements that could be improved, but the main issue is with the media, freedom of media. As it was mentioned already, the NGOs, they were also intimidated or pushed even to their right to express themselves about the questions on the referendum. So and judiciary independence is also an issue. There was a different opinion about the Supreme Court and Constitutional Court regarding the fifth question on the referendum. So we see that these final reports will probably reveal more transparency in the media ownership, in in finances of election campaigns through third parties, or generally campaign finance transparency. So we may say that there is a real problem having 4 times the same party in power with constitutional. So this could create a potentially more autocratic regime than a democratic regime.
And Peter, earlier you mentioned the international context and the war in Ukraine. What do you expect will be the consequences for these elections and their outcome for Hungary's foreign policy priorities?
Their priorities may not change, but I think they are losing their allies, at least within the European Union, because, for instance, Poland is supporting Ukrainians in their defense of their country, and Hungary is playing a bit still friend of Vladimir Putin, and is actually within the EU starts to be isolated. Also Slovenia and some other countries are moving in a different direction. So but of course Viktor Orban can change his attitude, and we will see how it will affect their position within the EU. There is also EU more pressure now with the conditionality of EU funding, and this may turn into because the level of corruption in Hungary has increased significantly over the last 10 years, and EU funding mechanisms of controlling EU funds are really weak in Hungary and could be abused easily. So this will be another factor which may affect the relations of Hungary within the EU.
Well, thank you, Peter. And final question, and I do realize that, of course, it's difficult to speculate about this, but I would be very interested in hearing your take on what the continued government control of Fidesz in Hungary means for the surrounding countries.
I think, this model of kind of autocratic leader with strong support and control of media is kind of catchy for some politicians, even in Slovakia, or was, and it could be still in the Balkan region to follow his Orban's path. But I think within the EU, he's losing a bit of momentum, and also within the Visegrad countries, in Czech Republic or Poland or even Slovakia, there are just some politicians which really like this kind of model of democracy. But I think, this will be posing a challenge for Mr. Orban and his government, even though he has a constitutional majority again in Hungary.
Thank you so much, Peter Novotny from Civil Eye. Let's now switch over to Serbia and talk about the Serbian elections. First, I want to talk to Bojan Klacar, Executive Director at the Center for Free Elections and Democracy in Serbia. Bojan, let's start. Can you give us an analysis of the electoral environment in Serbia and the elections and their outcome?
Thank you, Magnus, and good to hear you today. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. There are many news, or there are many angles for understanding of the election outcome in Serbia, and I will try to find the most important views. From my point of view, the main news from this election is the rise of the right. Right-wing lists have won almost 18% of the vote, which is the highest result in 10 years. I cannot say that these political parties are extreme far-right political parties, but I can say that we can talk about right-wing political parties. Their fuel for this election was the pro-Russian position in the Ukrainian crisis. Alexander Vučić, current president of the Republic of Serbia and leader of a ruling Serbian Progressive Party, won the first round of the presidential elections with great result, 58.5% of the votes, which kept basically his political power and proved to be the leader of the greatest trust here. The elections in Serbia also showed a drop in support for the ruling Serbian Progressive Party, which won almost 43% of the vote, which is the worst result for Serbian Progressive Party since 2012. On the other hand, the junior ruling coalition partner, the Socialist Party of Serbia, and his leader, Ivica Dačić, ex-prime minister in Serbia, stabilized and regained some of its voters, making it one of the biggest election winners. And from my point of view, SPS would be probably an avoidable actor in the new ruling majority coalition. In addition, for the first time in Serbia, Green Left political coalition passed the threshold and entered the parliament. And finally, one significant remark: immediately after the elections, the leader of the ruling party, Aleksandar Vučić, and the leader of the largest opposition list here, Dragan Đilas, ex-mayor of Belgrade, held a meeting after 4 years to discuss possible snap Belgrade elections, which was the request of the opposition leader, and basically which was the request of part of the opposition here. Aleksandar Vučić, as the president of Serbia, announced a few days ago that he was open to that proposal and that the snap Belgrade elections could be held until March next year.
Right. So, Bojan, of course, these elections we're talking about now, it wasn't that long ago since we had the previous round of elections in Serbia. The main thing with the elections in 2020 was that they were boycotted by many of the opposition parties. And I'm very interested, what were the implications of those elections and the boycott, and what happened after those elections for the elections that we just witnessed now, a few weeks ago?
Yes, you are fully right. As far as you probably know, shortly, main opposition parties, mostly from political center or left-green position, boycotted 2020 elections, and key reason was dissatisfaction with electoral conditions. And it was for the second time in political history in Serbia that part of the opposition boycotted one electoral process. What were the implications of that boycott? From my point of view, two things. The boycott initiated a more intensive continuation of inter-party dialogue about electoral conditions with the facilitation of European Parliament. And second thing, the boycott initiated greater pressure on the ruling party and his leader, Aleksandar Vučić. What happened after 2020 boycott? There were changes in the election law. There was limited progress in terms of electoral conditions, but the opposition was not satisfied with these changes, and they left the inter-party dialogue without a signed agreement in October last year. However, the opposition went to the elections this year in spite of the fact that they were not satisfied with the electoral conditions. So the election in April 3rd was held with full political competition here and with great confrontation, with great polarization between political players. So to sum up, the boycott, led to the improvement of the legal framework, but it did not strengthen the opposition. When I say strengthen, I think in terms of political ratings, in terms of political popularity. In fact, and it is paradox, the right-wing political parties, which mostly took part in 2020 elections, benefited on the elections the most from his situation. Right-wing parties in Serbia, for your information, did not even participate in dialogue with the European Parliament, but they negotiated directly with the ruling party and with the Serbian government.
That's really interesting. Actually, let me then ask you, in a sense, the same question that I just asked Peter, but instead of for Hungary, in relation to Serbia. How do you judge the quality of the electoral process and the state of democracy in Serbia today?
From a CESP perspective, the 2022 elections saw limited progress relative to the 2020 elections, and we believe that new electoral laws can serve as some kind of good foundation for improving the electoral process in the future and for discussion about electoral reform, because Serbia needs electoral reform. Serbia needs reform of electoral system. Serbia needs a reform of electoral administration. Basic civic rights were respected in the 2020 Serbian elections, which featured strong competition between the stakeholders and the broad and diverse set of political options. But there are some positive and there are many negative news or negative impact of this election. I will start with positive news. Electoral management body here, Republic Electoral Commission, managed the elections in accordance with legal rules, efficiently and transparently, and from our point of view, with tangible progress identified in its performance relative to previous elections. But there are many shortcomings. Even tough access to news outlets improved, since the 2020 elections. The lack of a level playing field in the media affected the ability of all political groups to present their views. Second, public officials appeared in the news during the election campaign, which by and large favor the governing coalition. In Serbia, it is very hard to put the line, to put the distinction between public officials' activities and party activities. There is blurring of boundaries between public officials and party position. ODIHR mission, for example, stated in its preliminary conclusions, and I saw one question about that in a question room. ODIHR stated that presidential and parliamentary elections here presented diverse political options, but a number of shortcomings resulted in an uneven playing field, favoring the incumbents here in Serbia. And finally, just one sentence about state of democracy. According to the latest Freedom House report, which was published a week ago, Serbia belongs to hybrid regimes like all other countries in the Western Balkans, but with a setback, with the deterioration compared to the 2020. According to The Economist, Serbia is democracy. Basically, Serbia is flaved or fragile democracy. And in accordance with varieties of democracy from Sweden, for example, they classify Serbia as electoral autocracy. Common problems in the field of elections in all these reports include media environment, include the blurring of boundaries between public and party positions, and include pressures on voters.
Thank you very much, Bojan. And I'll end with a question again, similar to what I was talking to Peter about. Serbian politics does not exist in a vacuum. There are a number of countries around us. Europe as a whole is being influenced by what happens in all our parts of our continent. What do you expect will be the consequences of the elections we just saw in Serbia on foreign policy? We're talking about the relationship to Russia. We're talking about attitude towards the war in Ukraine. And in contrast to Ukraine, Serbia is not a member of the European Union yet. What does the election mean in terms of the European integration of Serbia?
Thank you, Magnus. And I think that is one of the most important questions for Serbia at the moment. In Serbia, there is at the moment a huge debate about Serbia's foreign policy priorities and about Ukrainian crisis. These are very important elections in light of Serbia foreign policy priorities. And after many years, the main framework for forming the ruling majority, for forming the future government of Serbia, will be the foreign policy context. My expectations are that care will be taken of who will form the ruling coalition, as well as that Serbia's position will be closer to its Western partners, to United States, to EU, compared to the period before the elections. However, and I have to say, I think that this process will be gradual, and that any sanctions against Russia will not be imposed quickly or abruptly. Just for your information, the legal deadlines in Serbia are such that the government of Serbia does not have to be formed by the end of August, for example. And I think that Aleksandar Vučić, as the most popular leader here, needs time to decide about political dynamics and about solution which would be the most suitable for a Serbian context. Speaking about wide public here, speaking about public opinion, Serbian public opinion is very sensitive, and Serbian public opinion has pro-Russian sentiment. I'm talking about emotions, not about ratio. And Serbian public at the moment is not ready for radical changes or polarization. Currently, approximately half of the population here supports Serbia's decision to condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine in United Nations, but the other half has more citizens who express understanding for the Russian side. Why? Russia and China, before the Ukrainian crisis, are perceived as countries with a positive influence on Serbia. And the reasons for that, apart from emotions, are the attitude of these countries towards Kosovo and NATO bombing. Kosovo and NATO bombing are still, how to say, collective trauma for Serbian public opinion. And understanding of international players, understanding of international community from Serbian public opinion is always with huge link towards Kosovo and NATO bombing. Radical and abrupt solutions could jeopardize, from my point of view, the perception of public opinion towards Western partners and towards EU membership. Because I found that one polling agency, basically the biggest polling agency here, published a significant decline in support EU membership a week ago. For the first time in history, in Serbia, there are more citizens who oppose EU membership, 44%, than citizens who would support the membership, only 35%. Key reason for that is understanding of pressure from EU towards sanctions against Russia. And I will stop here. Speaking about EU and speaking about international players, Serbian public opinion is event-driven when we talk about relationship with EU and Western partners. Everything depends on event. If we have positive event, we can expect increasing of popularity. If we have some kind of negative trends or negative events, we can expect declining of support for EU membership or other Western partners.
Thank you very much, Bojan. And let's see then what events that will come up in the future and what that means for the attitudes on the issue. Thank you very much, Bojan Klacar from the Center for Free Elections and Democracy in Serbia. We'll continue the discussion with Nermin Nisic, IFES Country Director in Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia. Nermin, as you lead the IFES work to support the electoral process in Serbia, what do you see as the main challenges for the Serbian electoral process?
Thank you, Magnus, and thanks for having me today here. You may know Serbia recently passed a new set of election laws in February. It was just a few weeks prior to the parliamentary and presidential elections. There was extremely limited time for election administration to prepare for this process, especially coming out from delivering a referendum in January. And then it adds the new set of laws also added new role to municipal level of election administration. So that created a new set of challenges to the already existing ones to the election management body in Serbia to deliver credible elections. Now, looking ahead, one of the challenges that is ahead of us is building the capacity of election administration to fulfill the duties in line with the new legislation. Now, from our perspective, lack of permanent secretariat at the national level represents a major issue and a challenge to build capacity. This limits opportunity for engaging with an entity that can absorb the technical assistance that international community or other players could offer. Currently, I'll remind you that parliamentary secretariat technical staff is seconded basically to Republic Election Commission to carry out operational tasks, and they are part of the election administration for a short period prior to election day, and then almost dissolve as soon as elections are finalized, election process is completed. Now, looking at the bigger picture in terms of your question, there's really an issue of limited trust in the election process and institutions, and this is augmented by significant media polarization and spread of disinformation and alleged misuse of state resources. All of these things, coupled with what Bojan was discussing before. Global security issues, again, reflecting on what Bojan was saying, and Serbia's position on those issues certainly does not contribute to the overall stability and democratic processes in the country, and eventually reflect on election process itself.
Thank you, Nermin. So if those are the challenges that we're facing in terms of the Serbian electoral processes, what are the solutions? What needs to be done to meet these challenges?
A lot has to be done, and focusing on what I brought up first, which is election legislation. There is a desire, well, from our end, that another electoral reform process would take place or basically continue what was happening over the last 2 years, but in an inclusive and transparent manner. And hopefully such process would result in a consolidated election code, rather than having a multiple election laws regulating different election types. This issue is further augmented with the fact that in Serbia, different elections often take place at the same time. Recent elections was presidential, parliamentary, and the local elections in several jurisdictions. Previous elections are also a combination of local and national elections. So that's common, and this kind of a regulation of election legislation does not help. It is necessary, of course, to strengthen the technical capacity of election administration bodies at all levels, and that's a critical task looking forward to next elections whenever they happen. And Bojan discussed the possibility of repeated elections for Belgrade to take place in coming months, and there's 2024 local elections planned in Serbia. So we may also have, one could speculate there could be another parliamentary elections coming up, because over the last 20 years, I believe there was only one regular parliamentary elections taking place. It was always snap elections. it is needed to raise public awareness on when it comes to abuse of state resources. That's another important task, along with the work to increase trust in the institutions and processes. Some of the recent surveys basically point to the fact that there is a decreasing trust in processes in Serbia, and pointing that Serbian citizens are really looking into alternatives to what is being offered, and therefore rise of the far right parties in the recent elections. And also thinking long term, it is necessary to get engaged and work with new generations to improve their understanding of democratic and civic values, and make sure that they understand what their role in Serbian society is, and basically that they have a role.
I mean, you mentioned upcoming elections in Serbia. Well, if we look at the region as a whole, we have other elections coming up as well, including the general election in Bosnia and Herzegovina scheduled for October. How much collaboration is there between the election management bodies in the Western Balkans countries?
Yes, it's a good question. Election systems processes are very different, but there are a lot of similarities. Basically, that good bit of Western Balkan was a single country not that long ago, and it only makes it natural to see these new countries establishing some sort of a collaboration when it comes to sharing good practices among regional election management bodies. We see that there's more and more taking place in practice. I'll just add common language, elements of common culture, history, many other similarities. All of those lead to conclusion that it's very natural to see some sort of a collaboration taking place. And also, in addition to all of that, there's a availability of number of forums for election management bodies in the region to engage in discussion and exchange. And Magnus, your office also helped establish some of these forums, but also organizations like recently dissolved ACEEO, they offer a fantastic forum for technical electoral issues. There are also other regional initiatives, including a regional network of anti-corruption bodies that serve a similar purpose. And we, through our programming in each individual countries, also try and support such an exchange, as we believe that there are shortcuts to each of these countries, and they can learn from each other to make sure they are making progress, at least when it comes to technical elements of election process.
Well, talking about sharing experiences and learning from each other, final question then. What is IFES doing to support electoral processes and democracy in Serbia and in the Balkans as a whole?
Yes, in addition to what I just mentioned, we are delivering tailored technical support to many of the countries in the Western Balkans. We've been present in the region for well over 2 decades, currently operating in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, soon re-engaging in Kosovo, closing a program in Albania, but we're anticipating a new one dealing with anti-corruption to start soon. So our assistance is tailored and targeted, aiming at providing these countries and their often independent institutions and civil society groups with the much needed technical support and assistance. And our assistance ranges, as many on this call know, from helping tackle corruption and strengthen a culture of accountability, promoting the effectiveness and the credibility of democratic elections processes, supporting electoral management institutions to be more effective, and of course, increasing participation and representation of citizens. In our work, I think it's well known, we make particular attention to inclusion of traditionally underrepresented groups. So I would say our trademark is making sure that the assistance is tailored to each specific country and responds to the needs.
Thank you very much, Nermin from IFES. And we'll now open for questions, comments. If you have a question or a comment, you can type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And while you are typing away, I'll read out some questions that have come in already. The first question, which we could spend, in fact, we have spent entire online discussions on, is regarding abuse of state resources or misuse of administrative resources. Terms differ. And the question, and I'm opening this question to all our panelists, is what was the role of abuse of state resources in the elections in Hungary and in Serbia that we just saw? And what can be done to reduce such abuses in the future? Who would like to go first?
I may just step in just to say a few words about elections in Serbia and abuse of state resources. We've seen ruling coalition or ruling party better campaigning, preparing for next snap elections ever since 2020 June elections. They've been working hard on this and literally campaigning day to day. And no surprise that they've received the kind of support that they received. And along the road, we've seen significant number of instances of what would be considered as abuses of state resources, including using the pandemic situation to support citizens immediately ahead of elections with a number of financial injections, including promising some for after election period. And Bojan again mentioned some of these, hinted at some of that in his speech. Adding to what I mentioned earlier, it is important that we raise awareness of voters about what are the implications of abuses of state resources, and then to some extent, of course, legislative framework can address and help prevent the issues.
Thank you very much, Nermin. Marta, on the Hungarian side, what's your take on this?
Well, the abuse of state resources is a huge issue in the Hungarian election campaign, and it was very well pointed out by Odir, which talks about a pervasive overlap between the government and Fidesz, Mr. Orbán's political party. It's very hard, in fact, as a citizen to distinguish between the two and to tell who is speaking at one time. There is issues related to the abuse of state resources, which are formally lawful and cannot, be challenged whatsoever. So, for example, due to recent changes in the law, if there is a state body, a minister, for example, carrying out her official functions, this will not count as a campaign activity. So if it so happens that the minister goes around donating laptops and visits a school, handing out the laptops to the students during the political campaign, this will not be considered as a political activity that is part of the campaign. And so people holding public office can actually go out and campaign easily without limitations. Then there were several very concerning individual occurrences in Hungary, which also underscored this pervasive overlap. For example, when Hungarian citizens had the opportunity to register online to get the COVID vaccines, this database of emails, unless one was super savvy to untick certain boxes, was used to send out campaign mailings. So I, for example, did not untick that box, and I kept on receiving all throughout the election campaign information from the Hungarian government that absolutely echoed the Fidesz political messages, but this came out through the government electronic resources, completely unrelated to the campaign. And this was, I think, worsened by the fact that even if this happens, if you have effective remedies, if you have an effective, judicial remedy system, then you can correct it if it's fast, if there's, the effectiveness of the remedy can undo what happened. then this could be corrected, and no such effective corrective mechanisms exist anymore in the Hungarian election system. Another huge problem that was pointed out in the ODIHR report.
Thank you very much, Marta. Bojan, what are your thoughts on the issue of abuse of state resources in the elections?
Just one sentence. Nermin mentioned few things, but my point is that for Serbian context, the worst negative impact comes from combination of different shortcomings, combination of unbalanced access to media, misuse of administrative resources, and the blurring the boundaries between public officials and their party positions. And for Serbia, in Serbian circumstances, there is combination of those three things, and I think that recommendations or improvement can be in the field of media environment, because media environment in Serbia, from my point of view, is the key problem, not only for the position of different political parties and different politicians. I think that media environment is a key for misuse of public offices, because misuse of public offices is more how to say media issue more than anti-corruption issue. So my point is that we can understand the combination of different factors, maybe not even single factors such as misuse of administrative resources.
Thank you very much, Bojan. I should mention that in the Q&A, there are also some useful links that we put in regarding the NMO preliminary statements for the Hungarian and Serbian elections. So I would advise everyone to go and look at those. I'll also read out the question that's come in relation to Hungary specifically and to the electoral system. And I know, Peter, you mentioned that, so you may want to give a thought on this. I'll read out the question as it's written. My question dwells into the political implications of Hungary's electoral system. Why is the opposition unable to figure out ways to win given this electoral system? Should it not be possible to grab enough of the Fidesz votes to win more?
I think the electoral system is quite complicated, and Fidesz is very strong in rural areas where the most of constituencies are. And so it built up a very effective system of communicating with these rural voters. And even though opposition united for these elections, they lost some voters of Jobbik, for instance, which was split by several politicians who left Jobbik and created a new party. So it is difficult to organize an effective campaign in Hungary because of all of these dominance of Fidesz in the media and also using the state institutions. So I think these elections may show the leaders of opposition parties in Budapest that they need to go to the rural areas and understand the voters better there and their concerns, because I assume that the Fidesz party has a very strong network of institutions also, which are doing opinion polls and surveys among these electorates on a very regular basis, and they understood very well, and they were able to shift their messages and their campaign reacting to the war of Russia in Ukraine. So I think this is the way that also many intellectuals and politicians from Budapest really need to go out and do the grassroots work in the rural areas as well.
Thank you very much, Peter. Marta, you were kind enough to type in part of an answer to this question, but would you like to also expand on that here?
Yes, and I do agree with Peter in the sense that the opposition parties could have had a much more effective and persuasive campaign And it is not impossible, even with the very difficult conditions, to achieve a better election result. And I think the war certainly changed the atmosphere among many voters who might have been persuaded otherwise to consider voting for the united opposition. So certainly you can have a better, more effective campaign, better coordination, better messaging. You can have even better management of resources, but the huge dominance of resources will not be something that in its current setup, any united opposition would be able to overcome. So when you have all the state resources at your party's disposal, when you have excessive amounts of advertisement and just messaging on Facebook, for example, where third parties, where private individuals backed up by a lot of money from pro-Fidesz sources were really promoting their political message. It's just not something that the opposition could afford. And then on top of this comes a very weak institutional framework that cannot be considered as fair. So I think a better election result is something that they could have expected, and it didn't work out. But it's certainly not a fair playing field. And I think we have to really be mindful of the fact that democratic backsliding, rule of law backsliding will certainly impact election results too. The two things are so closely tied together. We have to look at this in a sort of a structural way. And there was other questions by Stefan Schwed asking about, what is the usefulness of ODIHR reports? I mean, this is a very fundamental question. I would always argue it's very important to use it. So an ODIHR report will not change a bad landscape by itself, but if many others will use it and consider it as authentically, credibly describing the problems, then I think we have a lot to cover with a strong, and this one is, I think, pretty strong still, report. And I would expect, for example, peers in the European Council to consider the implications of the critical remarks in the ODIHR report when they sit on May 23rd in the General Affairs Council and look at Hungary's track record on the rule of law.
Thank you very much, Marta. I do have to mention on the issue of ODIHR reports, just as a person who's worked on campaign finance issues for the last 20 years, there is a need for ODIHR missions to consider that section in many election reports may need to be a little bit more specific to the elections in questions than they sometimes are. That's just a side note. I won't go into details on that. Instead, I'll go to a question that's come in for Bojan Klacar. And I'll just read out the question. And we have touched upon this. The Serbian elections took place during the war in Ukraine, obviously. What was the impact of that war on the campaign and on the outcome of the elections?
Thank you. The Ukrainian crisis and Ukrainian war for Serbian circumstances, I think it was game changer, or I think that Ukrainian crisis was a fuel for a rise of the right, for a rise of the far right political parties. I think that junior ruling coalition partner of Aleksandar Vučić of Serbian Progressive Party, Ivica Dačić and his SPS, was also one of the election winners, having in mind their position, their pro-Russian position, if I may to say. And I think that Aleksandar Vučić, in terms of communication, in terms of his political marketing, he used on the right way situation in Ukraine, and I think that Aleksandar Vučić recognized that political stability, economic stability, that those issues are very important for Serbian public. So I think that Ukrainian crisis changed media and change media agenda, change priorities, change top concerns of people in Serbia, and I think that the opposition, especially a left-green opposition from political center, I think that Ukrainian crisis was bad news for their campaign, and I think that Ukrainian crisis is one of the main reasons why the opposition, why the civic opposition in Serbia did not, how to say, that they are not satisfied with election results here.
Thank you very much, Bojan Klacar. We have come to the end of our time together. I want to thank all our panelists. I want to thank all of you for participating. I again want to thank USAID for supporting this discussion and my IFES colleagues for preparing it. The next installment in this discussion series will be on May the 31st, and that will focus on the fight against corruption in European countries, and in particular, the role of digital transformation in that fight. So I hope to see you all in that discussion, and until then, stay safe.